My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and one of the things that Tolkien is famous for saying is that he cordially disliked allegory in all its forms. And this has created a lot of complicated questions about the nature of what exactly Tolkien was up to and when he was writing fiction, because certainly many people are right to point out the fact that The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory. It does not represent World War II. It does not represent really anything. On the other hand, a lot of people take this a little too far and say that none of his fiction represents anything in particular. It's all just good fun, when that's really clearly not the case. And in fact, you can't even say that Tolkien never wrote allegory. He certainly did. So what I want to do in this video is kind of explore Tolkien's relationship to allegory and take a careful look at what he actually said and what he might have meant, and how we can kind of put all this together in a coherent and consistent idea of what Tolkien had in mind. So as I mentioned, Tolkien definitely did write some allegory in his life, and the main example of that, the clearest example certainly, is the story that he wrote called Leaf by Niggle. And in this story, which I think I've done a video before, and I'll link to that in the description if I did. I'm almost certain I have one. It's been a long time though. But he basically tells the story of a man who is trying to, paint a tree. He starts with leaves. He paints leaves, and then he tries to get this idea of drawing the grander tree, and then there's like hints of other backdrops behind it and all this other stuff. But he's constantly putting off things that he's supposed to be doing in real life, not, just spending all his time on this painting. He needs to do things in his garden and fix up his house and help his neighbors out and all this other stuff. And he's constantly distracted by this one particular neighbor who's constantly needing help. And in the backdrop of all this, he's got this idea that he's going to have to go on this journey. He's going to have to. He has no choice. It's just a matter of when and how well packed is he going to be. Well, he finally ends up going kind of unprepared, and he then goes to this workhouse where he has to do a lot of work, and he, learns to manage his time better, and lots of things happen. Basically, the whole idea of the story is that Niggle, the main character, is him, and the painting is his first age mythology, more or less, and the thing that he really wanted to spend his time on. And everything else about it you can peg, pretty easily to something else. The trip he takes, of course, is death, and the workhouse is purgatory. And eventually he makes it, he accomplishes the what he needs to in purgatory, and eventually goes on to heaven. And of course, you have to remember this is in light of the fact that he's a Catholic. He believes in purgatory and heaven and all that. So it's a pretty clear allegory. There's really no escaping that the story is allegorical. Another one that is at least sort of allegorical and also somewhat biographical, which certainly Leaf by Niggle is, autobiographical, is Smith of Wootton Major. And I've definitely done a video on this one, and I can link to that as well. But it's much less of a strong allegory than Leaf by Niggle, because you don't really have obvious connections to different things. Although I will say, Tom Shippey, in at least two of his books, The Road to Middle-earth and Tolkien, Author of the Century, has a theory on what the story is allegorically, which I don't know enough about what he's talking about to really judge whether he's accurate or not. It's just not nearly as obvious to an outside reader for sure what it is. But his theory on it is really interesting, and it has a lot to do with like the profession that Tolkien was in and whatnot. So there's things to be said there that I don't have the competence to comment on, because that's not really my field at all. But anyway, it is seems at least a little bit allegorical, and or at least biographical, because the main character, Smith, seems to be Tolkien himself. He explores fairy multiple times, the world of fairy, which he's basically been allowed to do because he luckily swallowed this one particular magical star in a cake. And eventually he has to pass that on, and you can sense, even without knowing anything like the detail that Tom Shippey knows about, that he is talking about himself and his own gift of, creating fantasy, and he knows that he's going to have to give that up at some point because he's going to die. Um, and that, to me, is kind of the most obviously biographical slash allegorical part of the story. So we have this tension. We have, on the one hand, Tolkien saying that he cordially dislikes allegory, and the fact that he wrote at least one straight up allegory. Now, how do we reconcile these two? That's where it gets interesting. Of course, we have to start off by noting that Tolkien did not say he hated allegory. He said he cordially disliked it in all its forms, and ever since he became wary enough to detect its presence. And he follows that up by explaining what he means by allegory. And he says that allegory for him is, the purpose domination of the author in imposing a meaning on the reader, whereas applicability, which he was totally fine with, is the idea of the story being applicable in numerous different ways to real life, but that is kind of on the reader to find for themselves. It's not the author imposing it. Now, this doesn't explain how he comes around to write Leaf by Niggle, because Leaf by Niggle is a clear allegory, even by his own definition, in which he is imposing a certain meaning on the story, and that's painfully obvious. It's just clear as a bell that that's what he's doing. That doesn't mean, however, that he's contradicting himself. Certainly, he may not have particularly liked the idea of allegory, but we need to focus on the other part of what he said in that same context. And his comments on allegory, by the way, that I'm referring to, are in the foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings. If you have a copy of The Lord of the Rings, you almost certainly have this foreword, and you can go look and read the full text. But he points out not only what I've already said, but also he says he much prefers history, true or feigned. In other words, imagined history or real history. And of course, he's getting at the idea of not, when he says feigned history, he's not talking about like historical fiction per se, I don't think. I think what he means is like The Lord of the Rings is an imagined history. It's a historical novel in the sense that it's not, it's about a history of events. It's not an allegory. It's not it's not just a romance or a drama or something like that. It's about a historical setting and a historical, series of events that, all link up together. Because if you think about it, when he's writing the Silmarillion, that's more or less what he's doing. He's writing a gigantic history of an age of, theoretically, he's writing it as part of Earth's own history, but the idea there is not even so much that it's part of our history, but that it is historical in its form. So he prefers that mode of storytelling. Now, again, this still doesn't really help us solve the question of Leaf by Niggle, because that's not a particularly historical thing. It's biographical, but it's not really historical. It doesn't fit that frame. But I think the way that we can resolve Leaf by Niggle is fairly simply to acknowledge the history of that story. The interesting thing about the writing of Leaf by Niggle is that it's basically the only thing Tolkien ever wrote at one sitting and without really correcting much. Almost everything he ever wrote, he worked over endlessly. Leaf by Niggle, on the other hand, is a completely different animal, and part of the reason at least for this, is because it's not supposed to be a story so much as kind of a reflection on his life, and also in some ways a reflection on his own theories about the ideas of creation, subcreation, and that sort of thing. And of course, subcreation, that idea of subcreation, I've talked about in my video on fairy stories, where Tolkien puts a lot of time and effort into that as well. I'll link to that one in the description below. But the overall point of Leaf by Niggle is not so much to tell a story. It's to, you can look at it from a couple of different angles, but one of them is, a reflection on his own life, recognizing that he is very often put off things that he was supposed to do in trying to further this other end that he was really more interested in. But also because of the way the story plays out and the way that his own subcreation of the tree, Niggles that is, ends up being part of the thing that he achieves in purgatory, and it ends up being even more beautiful than he realized. It's it also becomes kind of a reflection of his own theory, stated very, bluntly on fairy stories and other places as well. The idea that we are made by a maker in his image, and so it is almost incumbent on humanity as a species to also make. That is part of what we are, as in his view, made in the image of a creator God, to ourselves be, in some sense, limited though it be, creators. And so Niggle, in his act of trying to be a sub-creator in painting this tree, he spends more time on it than he should, but at the end it is shown that his work is not for nothing. It's not a waste. It's not, necessarily against the plan, so to speak. It is valuable in itself in some ways. It's just, you haven't necessarily put your priorities in the right place by niggling over it so much. And that's, again, the point is Niggle, like Tolkien himself, niggles over details endlessly. And that's why he never finishes the tree and why he's always putting so much time into it. He's never completely happy with it. So Leaf by Niggle is not so much a story as it is something that is meant to provoke, a reader to learn a lesson. That is really the point of Leaf by Niggle. It's not about telling a story. And so I think we can explain Leaf by Niggle by saying he's not writing Leaf by Niggle as a story so much as he is, using an allegorical method to teach a particular kind of lesson through the mode of story, but he's not fundamentally trying to tell the story here. Smith of Wootton Major is a little bit easier to explain, probably because it's less obviously allegorical, and so therefore, you can kind of get away with saying, there may be allegorical / biographical elements in it, but it's not purely that, and therefore the story in itself also has, some value of its own, but it still kind of fits almost the same kind of mold as Leaf by Niggle. And certainly here I think you can get the idea that the motive behind it was in some ways, like Leaf by Niggle, kind of a reflection on his own life, because reading it as an older person, when I first read it as a kid, I didn't pick up on any of this kind of stuff, but reading it as an older person who, I've got kids of my own now, and I can kind of appreciate at least a little bit what an older Tolkien, and Tolkien was fairly old when he wrote Smith of Wootton Major, but I can appreciate a bit more of the position that he was in, and I can see some of the feelings that he might have been having as he wrote the story, where he's feeling a profound sadness knowing that he can't do this forever, but also a profound joy in the fact that he's gotten to do it to the extent that he could. And that's understandable. I mean, when you have something that is so amazing, and especially when in Tolkien's case, it's something amazing that he really can't share with anybody else. And that's kind of true of Smith of Wootton Major too. It's like Smith of Wootton Major, when he comes back from Fairy, he doesn't tell really anybody what he's been doing. But the sheer joy that he has of it, he sings while he works and things like that. And everybody kind of picks up on that around him. And you get the idea that Tolkien is kind of saying the same thing. Like, I haven't been able to share this really with anybody, because up until very late in his life, as he was writing The Lord of the Rings, he was hoping maybe with The Lord of the Rings he might be able to convince a publisher to take on the Silmarillion as well, and it didn't go through. So he never really knew that he was going to get to publish the Silmarillion until late in his life, and by then it was kind of too late, and he handed that off to Christopher as, his thing to do. Is like, that's going to be the thing that he hands on, is this, this vast project that Tolkien had taken on himself. But, just the emotion of it, reading the story, when you kind of know what it really is, you can see that really deep feeling of, I have this thing that is so amazing that I can't necessarily share with anybody else, but it necessarily affects the way I live and how I, interact with other people. And it's something that I'm going to pass on to somebody else. And, it's lucky for us that he was able to pass it on to Christopher. We never would have gotten the Silmarillion, perhaps, but you can see that in the story when you really know to look for it. And so it's I think you can put it in that same kind of a box as Leaf by Niggle. It's not teaching the kind of lesson that Niggle is, but it's still very much within that same kind of general feel. So those are, I think, how we can take care of those. But the other thing that I wanted to point out as far as Tolkien's comments, he's not against allegory per se. He's against telling a story that is an allegory. What he's against is the purpose domination of an author in the telling of a story. He thinks that makes a bad story. And the reason he thinks it makes a bad story is because he's kind of right. I mean, if you read Leaf by Niggle, it's an okay story, but it's very much a, you don't feel like you have any real freedom to enjoy it so much because what it, when you read it and you're paying careful attention, you know what it is. And you don't really have any options to go outside of that and take it to apply to anything else. Whereas the Lord of the Rings, you can read the Lord of the Rings and you can learn a lot from it, not because they, necessarily any one thing corresponds to another real thing in the real world, but because the kinds of interactions that happen and the kinds of things that go on are very parallel to the real world. And this is kind of the whole idea of fairy stories if you read into Tolkien's own theory. And Lewis, of course, shared this view, C.S. Lewis. Fairy tales teach truth. They are, it's a much more abstract kind of truth than what an allegory will do. An allegory will just straight up, mirror real life or, something along those lines. It'll mean something very clear. Like you take the Pilgrim's Progress, for example. C.S. Lewis kind of mirrored that in his book, The Pilgrim's Regress. And The Pilgrim's Regress is basically an autobiography in the style of The Pilgrim's Progress. So it's not a story, it's just an autobiography. And it's just an autobiography that's done in a fictional way, but it's like if you know what everything means, it's like it's not fiction, it's like a code, one-to-one correspondence. Tolkien wasn't into that. Leaf by Niggle, he could do that way because it wasn't about telling the story, but when he wanted to tell a story, Silmarillion, Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, none of those things are allegorical. Saruman does not equal anybody, and this is why he could later give a speech to a group in, I think it was Denmark? I may be wrong. It was one of the mainland European countries, a smaller one. But he gave a talk, and he said, I look around today and I don't see any Saurons, but I do see Sarumans running around. And so it's like he's applying his own story. He's not saying any of these particular people are Saruman, because they're not. Saruman was not meant to be, this person or that person in history. He's just saying that the kind of person Saruman is, I see many of them in history now. They're around us. And so he's not saying that these people are Saruman. He is saying these are the kinds of people that are out there. They have the same mindset. And you could say the same thing about many of the other characters. You've got, Boromir. How many people in the world could Boromir represent? Tons of people. The people who want to use power to obtain a good end, not necessarily uninnocently, but not realizing the fact that they're just falling into a trap that will, create more problems down the road because they want to take the ends justifies the means approach. So these are lessons we can take from the Lord of the Rings, but they're abstract lessons. Whereas the lessons that he's teaching in Leaf by Niggle, he has a very specific, concrete idea that he wants to get across. And that's how he's doing it, because he's using allegory. That's not what the story is about. That's not what stories are about in Tolkien's view. Stories are stories in and of themselves, and that's why they are enjoyable. Leaf by Niggle is not enjoyable in itself as a story so much. It's about getting the point. So that, I think, is kind of how we can reconcile what Tolkien says about allegory. And by the way, I should note, in one of his letters, he does say that Leaf by Niggle is not strictly an allegory. I don't think he can really get away with that. I think Tolkien was not entirely consistent with his own views all the time. He wanted to say it wasn't allegory, but clearly it is. I mean, you can't really get away with that. He wanted to call it mythical, but I'm not so sure. I think he was trying to backpedal a little bit when he realized what he had done, to be honest. Anyway, that aside, I don't think it's a problem that Tolkien wrote allegory. I think it would be a problem if people thought that like every story he wrote was allegory, because for Tolkien, writing stories was something that was good in and of itself. It's like if you can write a really good story that's enjoyable on its own as a story, that's the goal. That's what you do with storytelling. That's the reason we tell stories. Fairy tales in particular, they teach truths. They teach abstract, high truths. They don't teach concrete level, you should do this necessarily. I mean, like the most concrete thing you might get out of a fairy tale is work hard, be honest, that kind of thing. Those are still somewhat abstract, but the real allegory type stuff, that's when you get super concrete. It's like one-to-one correspondence between things, and you've got, you can't really escape that. At that point, it's no longer a story for its own sake. And that, I think, is really the point, is Tolkien is talking about the idea of writing stories for their own sake. Those are the best kinds of stories. Stories that are not told for their own sake, but are for the purpose of the author dominating the will of the reader through allegory. That's no longer a good story. It's no longer enjoyable. And part of the reason it's no longer enjoyable is because to the extent that you try to dominate the will of the reader, and the reader wants to resist the way in which you're dominating him, by definition, that will become less enjoyable. If your allegory is to say, this political party good or bad, or this position good or bad, that's going to rub some people the wrong way. Whereas if you think of Lord of the Rings, I can think of, people on the right, people on the left, people in between, people on the fringes, like tons of people of all different persuasions like the Lord of the Rings, and they can all pull what they want out of it. You can't really do that so much with allegory. The allegory is going to say what it says, and then some people are going to reject it because of what it says, and then some people are going to accept it because of what it says. That's not the way the Lord of the Rings works. So that, I think, is really how we have to see Tolkien's comments. He's not saying allegory is bad in and of itself. He's not saying, I hate allegory. He's saying, I don't want to tell a story that is an allegory because the storytelling suffers from allegory. Allegory makes a story worse. Storytelling ought to be storytelling, and that's it. If you want to use an allegory because you want to create a message, fine. It's no longer a story. And I think that's what Tolkien is really kind of getting at the end of the day. So, hope you enjoyed that video. Hope you kind of got a feel for some of the stuff out there that, the nuance in Tolkien's thinking about allegory. And certainly you could explore this topic even more. There's plenty of stuff he said that I didn't get into. It would make too long of a video. But if you did like the video, please do like it and give it a share. Please feel free to make comments in the comment section below if you think that there's anything significant I missed out on, or if you've got a different opinion. It'd be fun to talk about. And of course, if you want to follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, you can get some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions for some fun. And if you'd like to subscribe to the channel, you can do that here. Don't forget to click that bell icon. If you want to support the channel, you can do that here. And if you want to find some of my previous videos, you can do that here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.